Hey, what's up guys, it's Nick2, and today I'll be going over what I believe to be the absolute best Necromancer build for leveling, so you guys can just completely blast through the leveling process super smoothly and consistently with incredibly high damage output. This build is designed to work perfectly on its own, so you don't need to worry about getting lucky with legendary drops or anything like that while leveling. The build is just really strong by itself. Keep in mind that I'm making this video prior to the game actually coming out, so things are subject to change, and if they ever do change, I'll make sure to update the build video. Honestly though, I don't really expect things to change that much. Most of what I'm going to be recommending is based off of like a ton of playtime and experience throughout playing all the different betas, so the only instance in which things would change would probably be if something undiscovered actually gets discovered, or if Blizzard were to drastically change the balancing of different skills. Also, for every 1,000 likes that this video ends up getting, I'll be giving away a Diablo 4 Battle Pass, so if you're interested, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and drop a comment down below. Before we get into the video, I want to give a big thanks to today's sponsor, HelloFresh. HelloFresh is an incredibly convenient meal service plan that's going to deliver super affordable, pre-portioned ingredients straight to your door with easy to prepare, delicious recipes. With an average cooking time of only 15 to 20 minutes, HelloFresh not only saves you a ton of time by not having to go to the grocery store and plan out all of your own meals, but the meals themselves are quick and easy to whip up and are extremely tasty. There's a massive variety of recipes to choose from with over 40 different options each week to easily accommodate your diet and personal preferences, so you'll just never run out of amazing meals to try with HelloFresh. Not to mention, HelloFresh is actually super affordable, on average being cheaper than grocery shopping yourself because you're not going to be wasting any ingredients, and it's 25% cheaper than takeout. And it's going to be even cheaper if you use my link in the description or you go to HelloFresh.com and use code POGNICMAY16 because you'll get an entire 16 meals for free plus free shipping. Once you click, my description will also live update to count up the purchases. Definitely make sure to check out HelloFresh if you want to transform your eating habits, and a huge thanks to them for sponsoring today's video. Alright, starting off with the build, I'm just going to be going over point by point with you guys, talking about the order in which you want to spend your skill points so you know what to do while leveling, while also giving some detailed explanations behind why certain skills are powerful, and giving a little bit more nuance so you understand why we're using certain things, while also giving you some different options to choose between different things based on your personal preference. If you want a very easy to reference, just like image of the guide in terms of how to spend your skill points while leveling that you can reference while actually playing the game without having to, like skim through this video or whatever, I'll have an image of that linked in the description, which is just an article on my website at topdps.gg. There's also a written version of the build over there if you'd like to be able to easily reference that. Like I said, we're first just going to start out with the skill tree and go over, how you want to spend all your skill points. And towards the end of the video, I'll talk about some legendaries that you guys should be looking out for and the stats that you want to be prioritizing on your gear if possible. So when it comes to Necromancer, I'm going to have to be tabbing to this page a lot, talking about which minions you want to be using when you have access to them. You don't have access to all the minions starting out, so we're going to have to come back here and swap our minions around every once in a while. First off, at level 1, you only have access to skirmishers, and you just want to be using upgrade 1, and we're not going to have to swap this until level 12. So let's get into the actual skills that we want to be using. First off, we want to use Reap as our basic skill. This is simply just the best basic skill for leveling because it's actually going to scale the essence generation based on how many targets you're hitting, while all the other basic skills are locked to just a flat 8, flat 7, or whatever, and they're not going to scale in multi-target scenarios. So Reap, for example, if there's 5 enemies in front of you and you hit all 5, boom, that's 20 essence. That's immediately nearly enough to cast a core skill, while Bone Splinters or something you're going to have to cast multiple times. Bone Splinters used to do a lot of damage, but it did get significantly nerfed. It also has some vulnerable applications here, but honestly, we don't really need this at all, and Reap is simply just going to be our best bet for the essence generation. But it's also going to give us 15% damage reduction for 2 seconds after hitting an enemy, which is pretty nice survivability. I mean, 15% DR is nothing to scoff at. And then we have an additional 30% attack speed if an enemy hit by Reap is going to die within 2 seconds, which is going to be happening pretty often. The attack speed isn't really that great. It's kind of just for spamming Reap more often. Ultimately, the basic skill isn't super important because later on with the build, we're going to have so much essence generation through other things that we're not pressing our basic skill all that often, but it is decent having Reap for the scalability of the essence generation and the damage reduction like mentioned before. When it comes to our core skill, the absolute best one, and it's not even close for leveling, is going to be Bone Spear. Blood Lance is just kind of weak. Blood Surge is okay for AoE damage, but doesn't do crazy damage. Blight, I don't like that it's damage over time, although the damage is pretty high, but it requires the enemy standing in a circle. Sever is actually quite nice, but it simply just is not as powerful as Bone Spear. Bone Spear is going to do 85% of our weapon damage, which is very strong for a core skill, and it's going to inherently pierce through enemies, so not only is it pretty good for single target, but it has some decent AoE application as well, especially when you pair it with Enhanced Bone Spear, where it's going to break into 3 smaller shards after hitting the first enemy, and then those 3 smaller shards also have an opportunity to do some pretty good damage. One of the absolute best things about Bone Spear is Supernatural Bone Spear. We're going to be getting guaranteed vulnerable application on our main core skill, which is like unparalleled in terms of how powerful this is, having access to guaranteed vulnerable very, very early on by using our core skill here. Vulnerable, if you didn't already know, is a 20% additional damage modifier that is on its own multiplier. But you can also get vulnerable damage on your gear, so by the time you're level like 30 or something, you're probably going to have upwards of like 60-70% extra damage to vulnerable enemies. Having access to this early on is just incredibly powerful. A lot of people recommend Paranormal Bone Spear. I simply don't think that it's worth it because early on, you're just not going to have enough crit chance to take good advantage of this. And also, you're foregoing one of the best vulnerable applications that exist in the game, so ultimately, I just would not recommend Paranormal Bone Spear. Bone Spear also has a really good legendary aspect that you can get early on in the game. We'll talk more about legendaries later on, but figured I'd just mention it because it's a decent reason to use Bone Spear as well. Getting this is just going to make the enemy beyond the first, like whenever Bone Spear pierces enemies, it's going to make all those enemies vulnerable, which is really nice, as well as the bone shards from the Bone Spear are going to deal bonus damage to vulnerable enemies, and those are going to just do extra damage as well, which is super nice for just, more damage and more multi-target capability. Bone Spear also is fairly low essence cost, and it has a massive 50% lucky hit chance, which is really good. So ultimately, this is like the core part of the build, and it is incredibly strong for leveling. In terms of how you want to spend your next point, you can just drop the point into Bone Spear to make things easy. You could pick up Acolyte's Reap because it's going to give you a guaranteed corpse every 5 seconds, but once we're around level 12, we have good enough corpse generation, so you'd rather just not waste the point here, and makes things easier by going into Bone Spear. But if you want to min-max a little bit, or you just feel like you don't have enough corpses, feel free to sub this point in for Acolyte's Reap. Moving on to the rest of the build, we're going to be taking Corpse Explosion. This, I'm sure many of you guys have used this already, but if you haven't, if there's a corpse on the ground, you detonate it, it does damage in an AoE. Pretty satisfying to use. By default, it's only going to do 50% damage, but it is, no essence cost, and it just requires you just pressing the button. We're going to be spawning a whole bunch of corpses with our Skeletal Warriors Reapers, which we'll talk more about in a second here. But let's finish talking about Corpse Explosion first. So Corpse Explosion is our main source of like AoE damage. By default, like I said, 50% damage. It isn't that much, but when we get Blighted Explosion, this is really where this takes off, and it is a core part of the build. So Blighted Explosion converts Corpse Explosion into a damage over time like Blight Pool over the ground. It's going to do 110% of your weapon damage as shadow damage over 6 seconds. So we went from 50% to 110%, which is a 60% increase, which is very, very powerful. But also because it's shadow damage, we're going to, and convert it into a darkness skill, we're going to get to take advantage of a whole bunch of really cool stuff later on in the build. But also shadow damage is going to do more damage to enemies that have any sort of armor or physical damage reduction. So inherently, it's just going to do more damage than Corpse Explosion ordinarily would. Also, we're not going to have to dump any points into Corpse Explosion to buff the damage of it, because any point that we put in here is not going to increase the Blighted Corpse Explosion damage, so we get to, have a few extra points to spend. Because Corpse Explosion is a no essence cost, what we end up being able to do is spec into Grim Harvest here, and then once we are at level 12, we're going to swap our Reapers over to Upgrade 2, where they have a 15% chance to spawn a corpse off of enemies, and because we have multiple Reapers and they attack fairly fast, we're going to be getting a crazy amount of corpses, but also anytime that we kill an enemy, we're also going to be getting corpses. So what ends up happening is you roll up to a pack, you Bone Spear, make the enemies vulnerable. By the time you've Bone Speared a few times, you've probably killed a few guys, the Reapers have spawned a bunch of corpses. Now what you can do is spam a bunch of corpses, spawning a whole bunch of pools over the ground, just melting through everything, doing a pretty significant amount of damage, 110% over 6 seconds. And these also stack if they're like concentric, so it's going to do even more damage if there's more pools on the ground. But also, every time that we pop one of those corpses, we gain essence back. So we just dumped all of our essence with Bone Spear. Now that we're popping all these corpses, we're going to be getting all that essence back. And by the time that we have, 10 Blighted Corpse Explosions all on the ground, dealing damage over time, we can now start Bone Spearing again to just decimate everything. It's a super, super satisfying playstyle, and it just works really, really well early on. You just have really good essence generation, Immediately you have really good corpse generation. The Reapers do a really good amount of damage, and you have, you know, the really high damage of Bone Spear and really high damage of Corpse Explosion with the 110% damage modifier. But also because the darkness and shadow damage skill, it's going to work for a lot of other stuff, which we'll talk more about later. Moving on, we're going to unlock our next skill, which is Decrepify. This is a curse that is only going to cost 10 essence, so not that big of a deal. And it's going to slow enemies that get decrepified by 40% for 10 seconds, and it's also going to make them deal 20% less damage to you for 10 seconds. So not only is this going to give you basically 20% damage reduction, it's calculated differently, but more or less 20% less damage you're going to take, which is really, really solid as a survivability skill. But it's also offensive because slowing enemies is going to enable us to take damage versus crowd controlled and damage versus slowed on our gear. So anytime that we're fighting non-bosses, we can roll up, put this Decrepify in a really large area of effect. It's going to last for 10 seconds, which is pretty crazy. We're taking less damage and we're doing more damage to enemies. So ultimately, the 1 point into Decrepify is really good. You could probably rather get like a plus skill to curses or something like that on your gear, so you don't have to spend the point here. And then early on, you could also have an Iron Maiden for free if you get the plus ranks to curse skills. Iron Maiden we're not going to be taking later on. It is pretty decent for popping it down on the ground, and then any enemy that's actually going to hit your minions is going to, you know, take some damage from the Iron Maiden, but later on, I just don't really think that it's all that worth it. Right around now, we gain access to Skeletal Mages, and Skeletal Mages are pretty powerful. First off, we're going to be using them with Shadow because we don't have access to Cold yet, and we're just going to have Upgrade 2, so they deal more Shadow damage. Eventually, I believe once we're 22, we're going to swap this over to Cold for more Essence generation, and then we're going to swap it back to Shadow once we get our Key passive, which we'll talk more about later. Now that we have access to our mages, these guys do a crazy amount of damage and are really going to carry you early on, so we're just going to dump some points into buffing them. I didn't buff the Skeletal Warriors yet, but we are going to do that pretty soon. Actually, we're going to do that right now. I forgot about this. This is just going to improve their survivability, which also improves your survivability, because if they are up more often, they are taking damage for you, and they also just deal some pretty decent passive damage. At this point, we just want to max out our Bone Spear for more damage, going all the way up from, 94% to 119%, so that's really nice, just increasing our damage. At this point, we almost have access to our ultimate skill. Really quickly, I want to touch on Corpse Tendrils and Bone Spirit. So Bone Spirit is pretty good. I don't want to talk too much about it. I certainly just don't think that it is worth for this build. It's just way too much essence generation. You need a lot of stuff to really get it going. I think Bone Spirit is more of a late game thing, but for leveling, it's simply just better to be spamming your Bone Spear, especially with the Bone Spirit Legendary. Corpse Tendrils, I think, has some value in terms of the guaranteed vulnerable application, and there's also a really powerful Legendary here. I'll show it to you guys. It gives you some critical strike chance anytime that you use Corpse Tendril. Here it is, Aspect of Grasping Veins, 20% crit chance anytime that you use Corpse Tendril, which is pretty good. So if you get this legendary early on, or you happen to have already gotten it by completing the Corrupted Grotto in Kyrgyzstan, I think that's Act 4, but I'm not sure. If you already have this, then I would recommend using Corpse Tendrils simply just for the crit chance. If you don't have that legendary, like most of us though, we're just going to be spending our next skill slot on Bone Storm. So we're going to be dumping 1 point into Necrotic Carapace just to get some Fortify value. We're going to be spawning a crazy amount of corpses. This is a 2% value by default. And Fortify is going to give you 10% damage reduction when you have more Fortify than your current life. So this pretty much means you're just going to have 10% damage up a lot of the time because we're spawning so many corpses. One thing I forgot to mention, we're level 22 now, so we're going to swap our Gold Mages over to Upgrade 1 for the extra Essence generation. Now that we are level 25 we have access to our ultimate skill, which is going to be Bone Storm. You could experiment with Army of the Dead. I haven't used Army of the Dead all that much. This could actually end up being better for just melting bosses. Not 100% sure on that, to be honest. We're mainly just using Bone Storm as like a boss melting sort of skill. It's also going to give us damage reduction, but we don't really care. We mainly just care about the 20% crit chance. It does a little bit of damage. It's really not that big of a deal. I don't think it's like particularly powerful or like very integral to the build. We're not buffing it a lot, and we're also, the second that we get our Golem at level 25, we're just going to be sacrificing this guy. We just don't have the skill slots for it. It's just not good enough to warrant using. So Bone Storm loses some value because Bone Storm actually goes on our Golem as well. So if you don't want to use Bone Storm, feel free to, like I said, to use Corpse Tendrils, use Iron Maiden. You could mess around with Blood Mist if you just want some of the survivability here for the potential immune, or you could even mess around with Army of the Dead. I think that it's going to be good having 20% crit chance, and just, a boss melting machine also has a really high lucky hit chance, but it's nothing crazy, right? At this point, we have pretty much all of our skills unlocked, and we're just going to be buffing our minions here real quick. So we're going to be putting 1 point into Inspiring Leader, and then we're going to be dropping 3 points into Death's Defense. This is just going to drastically increase the survivability of our minions. It really depends if this is worth it right now. Like, if you notice your minions dying a lot, then you definitely want to just beeline this and potentially even upgrade it before you get Bone Storm. If you see that your minions are dying a lot and you're wasting a lot of your corpses by spawning the minions over and over again. But if you notice that they're, having pretty decent survivability, you can wait to spend these points here until you notice that they're dying a lot. Now that we are level 32, we want to sacrifice our Golem on the iron side so that we get the 30% increased critical strike damage, which is simply just better than the attack speed. You could also, at like level 28 or something like that, swap it to blood for more HP. Really just a minor upgrade there. When it comes to the next 3 skills that we want to spend before we can get our key passive, personally, I put it into Reaper's Pursuit because Necro is just incredibly slow and I want the additional movement speed here. But you could decide to, not go for this and go for some other damage stuff that I'll spec into immediately after the key passive. But we got to talk about the key passive because this is very important. So for this build, there are 2 key passives that are very good. Right off the bat, Ossified Essence is really good for simply just buffing the amount of damage that our Bone Spear does. And with this, you want to make sure that you have, above 50 essence every time that you cast your Bone Spear. It doesn't synergize as well, and it's a little bit clunky to play around with, but it is a lot of extra damage. But it's only for our Bone Spear, right? This is not going to be buffing our Corpse Explosion, which is a decent source of our damage. However, Shadow Blight is pretty weak on its own. How it works is a little bit finicky and, up for interpretation because we haven't gotten to play with it yet. But anytime that you deal shadow damage, it's going to infect that enemy with Shadow Blight. Once they are infected, you and your minions are going to deal 10% extra damage to enemies that have this on them. Every 10th time they receive damage from us, any sort of shadow damage, while they are affected by Shadow Blight, they're also going to take an additional 20% shadow damage. This is a little vague. Are they taking 20% shadow damage of the Shadow Blight that they have, or are they taking 20% shadow damage of the shadow damage that you dealt to them? I don't know. How fast Shadow Blight is actually ticking is also a little bit vague. This is not strong on its own. The reason that this is good is because of a legendary aspect that is insane, which is Blighted Aspect, where you're going to deal 50 to 120% increased damage for 6 seconds after the Shadow Blight key passive damages enemies 10 times. This would mean that the Shadow Blight needs to tick 10 times on an enemy. Depending on how fast the Shadow Blight ticks, this could either be completely terrible or insanely broken. Also on this website, I believe the max value is not actually 120%. I believe that it's higher than this. Not 100% sure, but usually this website doesn't account for the maximum roll on like putting it on a two-handed weapon. So this could be upwards of like 160, 170% extra damage, which is a ridiculous amount of extra damage. We're doing a whole bunch of shadow damage if you forgot. Here, I'll type this again. We're doing a whole bunch of shadow damage in the form of our Corpse Explosion being blighted, and that's a damage over time effect that's constantly ticking on the ground. So if you're in an AoE situation, you plop that down, that's going to deal damage to like 10 enemies. So if you deal all that damage and then after 2 seconds, Shadow Blight starts ticking, even if there's 10 enemies and it only ticks once per enemy, once every like 10 seconds or something, if there's 10 enemies, you instantly get the benefit of this from just popping down a Corpse Explosion. But we're also going to swap our mages over to Shadow, where they're just going to be constantly dealing shadow damage, and our mages are actually going to proc Shadow Blight as well. So we have a lot of sources of shadow damage with this build that should, in theory, proc Shadow Blight constantly for a... like, I cannot get over how insane this is, and I haven't really heard anybody talk about this, so I hope that I'm right in recommending this. But 120% damage that's a lot of damage, man, and that's on its own multiplier as well, of just a damage increase. So definitely try to unlock this as soon as humanly possible and test this out. Otherwise, if Shadow Blight doesn't seem to be working for you, then Ossified Essence is a fantastic option and is just going to increase your damage dealt. At this point, we have pretty much the entirety of the build unlocked, and we're just going to be spending some points on some passives, just deal extra damage. It's a little bit subjective here which ones are, actually more powerful per point spent, but I'm just going to go in the order in which I personally would. Feel free to deviate if you want, as long as you just get these points at some point. It's probably going to be perfectly fine. So at level 35 here, I'm going to be dumping 3 points into Fueled by Death. So every time that we consume a corpse, 9% increased damage. This is just 9% extra damage all the time. Then I'm going to put 3 points into Death's Reach. So I deal 12% increased damage to distant enemies. You could alternatively swap this to Death's Embrace if you want to play a little bit more close range, but Ultimately, I just think it's worse. This does give you some damage reduction as opposed to simply just flat damage via Death's Reach. So feel free to pick your poison. Now we're going to be putting 3 points into Serration so that our Bone Spear is going to have a 1.5% increased crit chance for each 10 essence that we have upon cast. So we have 100 essence. We're going to have 15% increased crit chance with our Bone Spear. This isn't really that powerful, but if we make sure to have decent essence each time that we cast Bone Spear, it's a decent increase in damage. Now we're just going to be putting 3 points into Amplified Damage for even more damage. So any enemy that we happen to curse, we're going to also just deal 9% increased damage to them, similar to the Fueled by Death on its own multiplier, so that's also really nice. At this point now we're going to dump 3 points into Hellbent Commander, so they just deal 30% increased damage if we're standing next to our minions. If you want to buff your minions earlier on and you just want a more passive playstyle, feel free to do that. I just left that out until later because I wanted to buff my personal damage more, but if you want to buff your minions more, or you want to do this like before Serration or something, you could 100% do that. Now we're going to be spending our points on Gloom, which is actually incredibly strong with the Shadow Blight passive and just buffing the damage of our Corpse Explosion. Again, it's not buffing the damage of Bone Spear, so it's not insanely good, but anytime enemies take damage from darkness skills like our Corpse Explosion, they're going to take 6% increased damage from you and our minions, stacking up to 3 times, so 18% increased damage on bosses with our Corpse Explosion and our Shadow Mages. And the Mages do a crazy amount of damage, but it's also going to buff the Shadow Blight key passive here as well. With our remaining 6 skills, we're just going to be pumping it into Unliving Energy and Imperfectly Balanced here for the extra damage with our core skills. I could see you getting this earlier on, but like I said, it's only a buff to Bone Spear, so it's not as powerful as getting something like 9% increased damage all around. So it's going to increase your essence cost, so not necessarily perfect here. And then we're just going to put the rest of our points into Unliving Energy. This isn't like super strong, and you could probably put the point somewhere else if there's something else that you really, really want to grab. But ultimately, I like having the extra essence because that just means more damage. One thing that seems a little bit interesting is potentially putting 1 point into Crippling Darkness just for a chance of stunning enemies. It's uncertain to me whether or not the Blighted Corpse Explosion has a 40% lucky hit chance per tick or 40% over the course of the entire 6 seconds. If it's a 40% lucky hit chance per tick, you'd probably actually get a lot of stun value out of Crippling Darkness by just putting like 1 point into it or something. So that could be pretty good. Terror is also decent for additional damage, but only with darkness skills and only to enemies that are slowed, so it's not really all that much extra damage, and it's more of a thing of like slowing, stunning, and immobilizing an enemy, which we aren't really doing with this build. Alright, when it comes to the Legendaries, the 2 most important ones, which I already mentioned, are going to be Blighted Aspect. Once you're level 35 and you have access to the Shadow Blight key passive, if this works the way that I think it does, that is a crazy amount of damage, and you always want to be putting that on either a 2-hander or a amulet. Probably the amulet because you want to replace your 2-hander a lot, because all of your damage is going to scale off of your weapon damage. The other legendary that you want is Splintering Aspect. You gain access to this deterministically pretty early on in the game, so definitely make sure to slap this on early on, probably on an amulet or on like a ring or something. Mainly just using it for the extra vulnerable, but also, extra damage from your bone shards is pretty good as well. I'm just going to talk about some other good ones. Edge Masters is just extra damage, and you do unlock this deterministically as well. So whenever you unlock this, you can start putting it on. They did nerf it pretty significantly, but it is extra damage nonetheless. Aspect of Frenzied Dead. Can't get deterministically, but really, really good to just buff your minions for attack speed. Anything regarding minions is probably going to be pretty good, so Viscous Aspect to increase how many mages you have, probably really good with the Shadow Mages. Bloodgetters Aspect just increase your warriors, so your Reapers are spawning even more corpses, that's probably pretty good. You gain maximum essence per active minion. I haven't even seen this before. That's actually probably really good with the Bone Spear stuff and with all of our minions that we're going to have active, especially with Viscous Aspect and Bloodgetters. That's probably a lot of extra essence. That's really, really strong. Maybe I'm high or something. I could have swore there was like an aspect that literally just increased the amount of damage that minions did as long as they were out. Maybe it's not on the website, but regardless, the attack speed basically ends up being extra damage. When it comes to the stuff that you want on your gear, I guess I'll go over gems real quick, which I just forgot to put here. Usually for gems, you want emeralds on the weapon for extra damage against critical damage against vulnerable enemies. Armor, you want rubies for max HP. Jewelry, you can go for skulls over diamonds just for like blanket resistance. Probably not that big of a deal because, like I said here, you're not going to have to optimize much around this while leveling. When it comes to what you actually want on your gear, in terms of like prioritizing the stats that you want and stuff, getting weapon damage is your #1 priority because all of your damage scales off of your weapon damage. So anytime that you get a weapon that has like 10-15% more weapon damage, it's probably more worth it to just equip that than and like kind of ignore the stats on it. It depends. I'd say more often than not, just equip the weapon that has a higher DPS number. Next to that, anything like ranks to Bone Spear is going to be really good. In terms of like ranks to other stuff, nothing else really matters because getting ranks to Decrepify won't do anything. Corpse Explosion also doesn't do anything because it's not going to scale up anymore once we're using the Blighted Corpse Explosion. So the only ranks that you really care about is Bone Spear, or I guess ranks to Curses, so you don't have to spend the skill point on Decrepify, I guess is what you would do. Next to that, vulnerable damage is probably one of the better things to get, even better than core skill damage, because we're making enemies vulnerable with our Bone Spear, and that's just a whole bunch of extra damage. Core skill damage is only going to buff our Bone Spear, not our Corpse Explosion, so not super good, but still pretty strong. Crit chance and crit damage is good, but keep in mind that crit doesn't work with our Blighted Corpse Explosion because it is a damage over time skill, so it can't benefit from crit chance or crit damage. So crit chance isn't like insanely good. Movement speed is pretty good because Necro is really, really slow, so definitely look out for some stuff with movement speed, just improve how quickly you're doing things. And damage to slowed / CC'd is going to be really good with our Decrepify, slowing and crowd controlling enemies, so we gain access to this damage modifier. We'll have a link to this fully kitted out one, but also just make sure to check my website, topdps.gg, for the written version of this guide, as well as the image to reference. That's going to be it for the build. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. If you did, please make sure to drop a like, subscribe for videos similar to this one, and make sure to check me out over on Twitch. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you guys later. Peace.